At 6 that morning, water entered Dry Creek Canal for the final scheduled release of the summer. In 72 hours, the gate would close again. A few farmers waited outside the station. The others were spread along the pipeline, standing beside branch valves, meters, and nearly empty stock tanks. Micah Reed turned the key, and the diesel engine caught on the second try. The engine ran steady, but the pressure gauge barely moved off zero. The restored pump had survived one short test. It had never completed anything close to a 72-hour field run. Every minute without pressure reduced the margin in Micah's schedule. Before the last farm could receive its share, the old system still had to survive 2 nights of pumping, 8 branch changes, and whatever the buried pipeline exposed. 3 months earlier, none of this had a deadline attached to it. Micah Reed was 17 years old, and he lived with his mother on a small cattle operation in southern Oklahoma. The Reed family had worked this land for 3 generations. Lena's grandfather had helped dig part of the shared canal when the farms still depended on one another. The farm was small, and the collateral behind it was thin. Borrowing money for a deep new well had never been simple for a place this size. Most mornings started the same way that summer. Micah walked out before sunrise and checked the stock tank level first. Then he checked the well pump, listening for the sound it made when it strained. The well still pumped water, but the time it took to fill the tank had nearly doubled. The motor had to run longer to do the same job it had always done. The electric bill climbed with it, month after month. Lena stopped irrigating one pasture just to protect what the cattle needed. She didn't announce it. She just quietly let that section go brown. Micah started writing the flow numbers down every single day, like it was a habit he couldn't stop. He kept the notebook on the kitchen table, next to the coffee pot, where his mother would see it. One evening, Lena sat down across from him and looked at the numbers herself. She didn't say much at first. She just tapped the page twice with one finger. Then she said the thing that would end up defining the whole summer. A well doesn't have to go dry to stop being enough. At the far end of an old irrigation canal sat a pump station that had not run in 8 years. It had once moved allocated water from the irrigation district out to 9 small farms. Most of those farms had switched to private wells over time, one by one, and the station had simply been left behind. Nobody had torn it down. Nobody had needed to. It had just gone quiet, the way things do when fewer people depend on them. The station had been built back when 9 farms shared one canal and split the cost of moving water together. Over the years, deep wells got cheaper, and one farm after another drilled its own. Each time a farm left the shared line, the station lost a little more of its reason to exist. By the time the last farm switched over, there was nobody left to justify keeping the pump running at all. Some of the older farmers still remembered what it sounded like when the engine used to run every summer. Nobody had expected a teenager to be the one asking about it again. When the irrigation district began liquidating equipment it no longer used, Micah asked to walk through first. He found a pump housing with no visible cracks. He found a shaft that still looked like it could be restored. Some of the valves and pipe fittings were still sitting where they had always sat. The concrete pad underneath the station was solid, and the main line still connected out to the small farms. Other buyers walked through the same building and saw scrap metal, nothing more. One of them told Lena exactly what he thought, standing right there in the doorway. "You just paid $500 for a shed full of rust." Lena didn't answer him. She waited until he'd left before she said anything to Micah. "If this doesn't work, that $500 is gone. You understand that?" Micah understood it, and he told her so. He also told her what he saw when he looked at that same rusted building. Not a working station yet, but something worth trying to save. Lena paid $500 for the equipment being sold as is. She signed her name on the receipt herself. That price covered the pump, the diesel engine, and a handful of leftover valves and parts, sold as they sat. It did not cover the land underneath the station. It did not cover the canal. It did not cover the water itself. It did not cover the right to operate the station. And it did not cover any right to take water whenever someone wanted to. Daniel Voss managed the irrigation district, and he laid the terms out plainly across his desk. Lena would need a separate seasonal lease just to use the station grounds. She would need insurance. She would need a technical inspection. And she would need the district's approval before anything could run. If the station ever pumped outside its scheduled hours or moved more water than its allocation allowed, the district could shut it down. Daniel said it once, and he made sure it landed. "You're buying equipment, not water. Every gallon must come from an approved farm allocation and follow the district's delivery schedule." Micah wasn't selling water, and he made sure people understood that from the start. Micah was not selling water. He was selling a pumping service. Every gallon had to come from an approved allocation, and the meters had to prove where it went. Some of the farmers who might have joined refused to put any money in at all. They didn't believe a 17-year-old could get an old station through inspection. Calvin Price owned a larger operation nearby, with a deep well and his own irrigation system. He came by once, mostly out of curiosity, and stood looking at the rusted engine for a long minute. "The pump may be cheap, but the water doesn't come with it." Micah answered him plainly, because it was the truest thing he could say. "I know. The farmers already have approved allocations. They just don't have a working way to move that water." Calvin nodded slowly, like he was filing that answer away for later. He didn't invest that day, but he didn't walk away for good either. He came back twice more over the following weeks, never staying long. Once, he watched Micah bleed air out of a valve without saying a word. Another time, he asked how many farms had actually signed on so far. Micah told him the truth. Not many yet, and no promises beyond what the meters could prove. Calvin didn't sign anything that day either, but he stopped calling it a waste of $500 after that. Earl Dawson had spent years maintaining stations like this one before he retired. He walked through the building with Micah, checking bolts, checking corrosion, checking the old drivetrain by hand. He didn't sugarcoat what he saw. Making it turn is one job. Making it move measured water without hurting somebody is another. Earl agreed to guide Micah through the mechanical work. He made it clear, right there in that first walkthrough, that he wasn't a licensed inspector. Anything that needed certification would still go through a certified person, no exceptions. At first, Micah's plan was too big for what the station could actually do. He wanted every branch line restored. He wanted every pasture irrigated. He wanted to serve any farm willing to pay, and run the pump close to full capacity for as long as fuel allowed. Lena stopped him before he got any further into the drawings. She made him answer a short list of questions, one at a time, out loud. Who actually had a valid allocation? How many of the old branch lines still worked? What the pump could realistically serve, not what it was rated for on paper. Who was paying for fuel, and who was responsible if a pipe burst under pressure? Micah didn't have good answers yet, and he knew it, so he spent the next several days walking the old lines on foot, farm by farm. At the first farm, an older rancher just laughed and said the line had been dead for years. At the second, someone showed him a valve buried under a decade of grown-over grass. At a third, a woman named Ruth walked the fence line with him for almost an hour. She remembered when the station used to run every summer, back when she was a girl. She told him which of the old branch pipes had been pulled out for scrap and which hadn't. That single conversation saved him 2 full days of digging around blind. Not every farm welcomed him the same way. One man told him flatly that he didn't trust a plan that started with a rusted engine and a rumor. Micah didn't argue with him. He just kept walking the line, farm by farm, taking notes. By the time he'd finished, the numbers had narrowed a lot. Only 9 farms still had a workable connection to the station. Several of the old branch lines had already been removed or abandoned completely. The station was never going to irrigate large stretches of pasture, no matter how well it ran. Most farms didn't need that anyway. Most of them just needed enough to keep the cattle watered and to hold a few acres of crop that hadn't been harvested yet. June Holloway ran cattle on a farm at the very end of the line, farther from the station than anyone else. She met Micah at her gate, arms crossed, and let him talk for a full minute before she said anything. "We don't need you to save every acre. We need enough water to keep the animals here." Micah scaled the plan down to match what was real, right there at her fence line. The cleanup work took weeks after that, and most of it was not dramatic. Scraping rust off the housing, repainting exposed metal before the next rain could reach it, patching the roof on the station house, one sheet at a time. None of that made for a good story on its own. But 3 specific failures nearly ended the project before it began. The first came on a quiet afternoon, with the engine finally running strong. Micah watched the pressure gauge, waiting for the needle to climb, and it didn't move. Earl leaned in close to the housing and told him to cut the engine. They found it fast. A check valve wasn't sealing all the way. Water was slipping backward through the line instead of moving forward, undoing every gallon they pumped. Replacing that valve ate through almost all of their reserve money in a single afternoon. The second failure came during a low-pressure test, days later. Water suddenly sprayed up out of the ground along a buried section of pipe. The old station map didn't match what was actually underground anymore. Farmers who had been watching from a distance started showing up with excavators. Nobody asked them to come. They just came, digging until they found the broken section. They helped isolate it from the rest of the system before the day was over. The third failure was quieter than the other 2, but it mattered more in the end. The old meters at each farm connection gave numbers that didn't line up with each other. One meter read high, another read low. Nobody could say which number was true. Daniel Voss refused to approve the station for operation until that was fixed. Lena rented a set of district-approved seasonal meters instead of buying new equipment outright. She installed a verified master meter at the station itself and calibrated meters on each active branch. That way, the total leaving the station could always be checked against every delivery it made. Earl stood in the doorway that night, watching Micah stare at the 3 failures written on a scrap of paper. He didn't offer any comfort. He just said the machine had always been the easy part. Micah asked him what the hard part actually was, half expecting a joke back. Earl didn't joke. He said it was getting 9 different families to believe the same set of numbers. Micah stood in the station house that evening, looking at the new meter on the wall. He realized something that stuck with him for the rest of the summer. Fixing the pump had never been the hard part. Earning enough trust that people believed the numbers, that was the hard part. By the time all 3 failures were behind them, the loan Lena had taken out was close to its limit. Fuel prices had climbed. 3 of the farmers who'd originally shown interest pulled their commitments, one after another. The system still wasn't fully approved, and the seasonal lease payment was due regardless. Micah offered to sell off the spare engine parts, just to bring in a little cash and slow the bleeding. Lena didn't answer him right away. She went to the drawer where she kept the well records and set them on the table between them. The numbers showed their own farm's flow still dropping week after week. She asked him the question that reframed the entire project. Are you trying to prove the old station can run, or are you trying to get water where it's needed? Micah sat with that question longer than he wanted to admit. He didn't answer her that night. He went out to the station bed and sat in the dark for a while. The engine looked the same as it had for weeks, patched and ugly and stubborn. But the question stayed with him, even after he'd walked back to the house. The project had never been about restoring everything the station used to do. It was about meeting a real, narrow, minimum need and doing it in a way people could trust. By the next morning, he'd stopped talking about what the station could do. He started talking about what it owed to every family that might have to depend on it. That shift in language was small, but everyone around him noticed it. June was the one who pushed the plan into something that could actually survive real pressure. She came by the station with a legal pad and laid it flat on the workbench. If every branch line opened at the same time, she said, the farms closest to the station would pull the most pressure. The farms at the end of the line, hers included, would end up with almost nothing. and whoever was willing to pay the most could end up eating most of the available time. June laid out a different structure, point by point. Open only one group of branches at a time. Record the meter readings before and after every single delivery. Give the stock tanks priority over anything else on the line. Cap the water, going to a handful of high-value crop sections instead of letting them expand. Don't let anyone buy extra time until every registered farm had received its agreed minimum. And build the plan around 58 hours of active pumping, with 14 hours held back as a buffer. Micah wasn't just repairing a pump anymore. He was building a distribution system that could be checked, questioned, and proven, one reading at a time. The irrigation district allowed one short trial run before the real release could begin. The canal gate opened, the pump was primed, and the engine started clean. Pressure climbed the way it was supposed to. Micah watched the gauge, then watched the meter, then looked down the line toward June's farm. Water reached the meter at her branch connection, and the needle on it turned. It was enough to prove that the final connection was open. But the test ended long before her stock tank received the amount her cattle would actually need. June checked the reading against her own meter at the gate. The two numbers were close enough to satisfy the district's verification requirement. She signed the first verified test record of the summer, not a receipt for a full delivery. 2 more farms watched the trial succeed and signed on for the next release. That brought the total to 3 registered farms, with June counted among them. Over the following days, 6 more farms watched from a distance as the paperwork came together. Well flow kept dropping across the area, week after week. One well started pulling air along with water. One farm had to rotate its own pumping hours just to keep its tank full. Daniel confirmed what everyone already suspected, that this would be the district's only approved release of the summer. The first of the 6 was an older couple who had almost sold their herd that spring. They read the test record twice before they signed anything. The next 2 farms belonged to brothers who worked the land side by side. They didn't ask many questions. They just wanted a date and a number. One farm nearly backed out when the fuel cost came up, until June spoke on Micah's behalf. The last 2 signed within a day of each other, once word had gotten around the valley. By the end of the week, all 6 had signed. Micah locked the final schedule. 9 farms, 58 hours of planned pumping, 14 hours held in reserve. No new customers added after that point. Daniel made the timeline official, standing at the station with the paperwork in hand. The final release begins Monday at 6. When the 72 hours are over, the gate closes. That brings the story back to where it started, with the engine running and the gauge sitting near 0. Micah checked the water level at the pump's intake, and it looked sufficient. He checked the main valve, and it was fully open. The engine was holding its speed just fine. The pump itself had lost its prime sometime after the last test run. Micah and Earl worked through the priming process again, step by step without rushing it. After almost 40 minutes, the pressure finally began to climb. They hadn't lost any of the system's approved water. But the 14-hour reserve had already dropped to just over 13. Someone updated the number on the board at the station, and the countdown kept moving. The hours after that didn't disappear all at once. They went in small pieces, the way hours usually do on a job like this. 19 hours into the release, Calvin's well flow dropped faster than he'd expected. He drove over to the station and found Micah checking a gauge near the engine. He offered 3 times the normal rate. In return, he wanted an earlier slot and several extra hours. It might keep more of his herd supplied through the rest of the summer. That kind of money could have covered most of what was still owed on Lena's loan. Micah understood the offer completely. He didn't need it explained twice. But those extra hours would have to come out of some other farm's approved time, not out of nowhere. He thought about June's schedule, still sitting untouched at the end of the line. Then he turned Calvin down, as gently as the situation allowed. You can pay for the pumping. You can't buy somebody else's approved allocation. Calvin didn't argue the point, and he didn't walk away from the system either. He kept the time slot he'd already registered for, exactly as he'd started. After Calvin left, the schedule kept moving. Several of the 8 planned branch changes took longer than they had looked on paper. Every meter reading had to be confirmed before the next valve could open. Refueling took time. Pressure checks took time. Water took longer to reach the distant farms than the schedule had allowed for. By hour 30, everyone on the line was running on very little sleep. Micah and Earl split the overnight watch, trading 2-hour shifts at the station house. June kept a lantern by her gate and checked her own meter every time she woke up. One of the brothers fell asleep against his truck with a flashlight still in his hand. Nobody woke him until his branch was ready to open. Nobody complained about it either. Everyone understood what the schedule was asking of them. By hour 41, the reserve that had started at just over 13 had shrunk to 4 hours. Nobody had made one large mistake to cause that. It was the accumulated cost of running an old system carefully. 41 hours in, the numbers on the central meter stopped adding up. More water was leaving the station than was arriving at the farms combined. Somewhere along the line, the system was losing water it couldn't account for. A few people wanted to keep pumping anyway, since the window was already narrowing fast. Micah shut the engine down instead, before anyone could talk him out of it. They found a cracked coupling near one of the abandoned branch connections. Farmers who were still on site brought equipment over without being asked. They dug out the section, isolated the damaged branch, and replaced the coupling by hand. Then they pressure tested it again before anyone touched the controls a second time. That repair erased the remaining buffer completely. From that point forward, every farm had to stay inside its exact delivery limit, or June would lose the final slot. Nobody said that sentence out loud, but everybody on the line understood it anyway. The pump came back online near hour 45. From that moment forward, the schedule had no margin left. Micah walked the pipeline before the remaining deliveries resumed. He checked every visible joint by hand. He didn't trust the numbers alone anymore. He wanted to see the line holding, not just read it on a gauge. Earl walked the opposite direction, meeting him somewhere near the middle of the route. Neither of them found anything new. That felt like the first good news in hours. Over the next 21 hours, the remaining farms stayed inside their exact delivery limits. Nobody asked for an extra minute. Each meter reading was confirmed before the next delivery began. Every remaining valve change was reported back to the station by radio. By the time the clock passed hour 66, only June's final delivery remained. With less than 6 hours remaining in the release, the final stretch of pumping began. Several farms had already received everything they were owed. June's farm, at the very end of the line, still had its last delivery outstanding. As the release neared its end, the water level in the canal began to drop. The pump started showing signs of unstable suction, the gauge flickering instead of holding steady. Earl checked the intake reading against the approved operating range, right there beside him. Micah had to choose between two options, and there wasn't much time to weigh them. He could keep running at high output and try to finish quickly, risking damage to the pump, or he could slow it down, protect the equipment, and accept the risk of running short on time. Under Earl's supervision, Micah lowered the pump to its safest approved operating rate. Water moved more slowly through the line, but the pressure held steady and controlled. With very little time left on the clock, the meter at June's farm began to turn. This time, it didn't stop after a few seconds like the test had. Water kept moving, filling the stock tank at the true rate her herd had been promised. She received exactly the priority amount that had been agreed on, nothing more and nothing less. Right after that, Micah shut the pump down before the intake level could drop past the safe limit. By the end of the 72 hours, all 9 farms had received the priority water they'd agreed on. No farm got its full acreage irrigated because that had never been on the table. The stock tanks were refilled. A few small sections of high-value crop made it through another stretch of dry weather. The total amount pumped stayed within the approved allocation from start to finish. Every single delivery had been measured and logged. branch by branch. The station shut down exactly when the release window closed, not a minute after. Calvin understood, without anyone needing to explain it to him, what would have happened if Micah had said yes. If those extra hours had gone to him, June's farm might have lost its final delivery entirely. Daniel Voss reviewed the season's records and agreed to let the station keep operating next year. The condition was simple: the same limits, the same meters, the same rules. June told Micah, once the paperwork was finally signed, that she doubted him at the very first gate meeting. She didn't hide that from him. She just said it plainly, the way she said most things. Micah told her he doubted himself too, more than once, somewhere around hour 41. Neither of them made it into something bigger than it was. It was just true, and both of them let it sit that way. The Reed family didn't come out of the summer with much money. They covered part of what they'd spent and set up a shared maintenance fund with the other 8 farms. Lena had grown up watching small farms leave the shared line one by one, year after year. Now her son had helped bring 9 farms back onto that same measured system. She repeated the line she'd said months earlier, the one that had started all of it. A well doesn't have to go dry to stop being enough. Micah answered her with the thing he'd actually learned that summer. Then one pump doesn't have to save everything. It just has to move what we're still allowed to use. The old station did not create water, and it did not defeat the drought. It gave 9 farms a measured, lawful way to share what remained. And it made sure the family at the end of the line was not forgotten. The canal gate closed. The pump went quiet. Micah wrote down the final numbers on the board, one line at a time. June stood by her stock tank, watching the water settle. Somewhere down the line, one of the brothers coiled a hose that wouldn't be needed again until next summer. Ruth stopped by the station on her way home, just to look at the pump one more time. She didn't say much. She just nodded at Micah, the way people do when words feel unnecessary. Lena stood at the edge of the concrete pad, watching her son close up the station for the night. She thought about her grandfather, who had helped dig the first section of this same canal. She didn't say that part out loud. She didn't need to. And the old pump station sat still under the evening light, having done exactly what it was built to do, and nothing more.